He thought his life was under control, until the day he walked into his office and saw her sitting there, holding 2 children, and heard the words that shattered everything, "These are your daughters." Mark Jameson had it all. He was a millionaire, the CEO of a successful tech company, respected by his peers, admired by his employees, and constantly moving forward in his career. His life revolved around business deals, strategies, and high-stakes meetings. The idea of having a family, settling down, or even having time for anything other than work never seemed to cross his mind. He was driven, focused, and had built his empire by sacrificing his personal life. Success was his only priority, and it had paid off in every imaginable way. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings and conference calls, Mark returned to his office. His company's headquarters was a sleek, modern building, designed to impress, filled with cutting-edge technology and the latest in luxury. As he walked through the entrance, he felt the familiar rush of power and accomplishment. This was his domain, a place where everything was in order, and he controlled everything around him. He swiped his access card and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for his private floor. The elevator doors slid closed, and for a brief moment, he closed his eyes, letting the quiet of the ride soothe him. It had been a long day, and all he could think about was getting home, having a quiet evening, and recharging for the challenges ahead. When the elevator chimed, signaling his arrival, Mark straightened his tie and stepped out, making his way to his office. As he approached the door, he paused. There was an unusual sound coming from inside. It was soft at first, almost like laughter, and then the sound of children's voices. He frowned, confused. This was his office, his sanctuary, a place where he was never disturbed, a place of business, not play. He pushed open the door, and what he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. Sitting in his chair was a young woman he didn't recognize, her eyes warm but serious. Next to her, on the floor, were 2 toddlers, twin girls, both around 2 years old, giggling and playing with some toys scattered across the floor. They looked up at him with innocent eyes, their faces full of joy. Mark's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. He had never seen this woman before, and he certainly didn't have children. What was going on? The woman looked up at him and smiled. "Hi, Mark," she said softly, as if they had known each other for years. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign of uncertainty. She spoke to him as if they were old friends, as if this moment was perfectly normal. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen in the doorway. His eyes darted to the children, then back to the woman. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman's smile never faltered. She stood up, gently taking one of the toddlers by the hand and guiding her toward Mark. "I'm Layla," she said. "We met a couple of years ago. You don't remember?" The name didn't ring a bell. Mark racked his brain, trying to recall any interaction with her, but nothing came to mind. He had so many meetings, so many fleeting connections with people, but this was different. The fact that she was here, in his office, with children who seemed so comfortable around him, made him feel like his world was crumbling. "You don't remember?" she asked, noticing his blank expression. "We met at a conference in Chicago. We spent some time together, and well, here we are." Mark blinked, trying to piece it all together, but his mind was racing. He couldn't comprehend how this was possible. What had happened during that trip? He didn't remember any of it clearly, but clearly, there was more to the story than he had imagined. These are my children." His voice was a mixture of disbelief and confusion. The twins giggled again, their innocent faces staring up at him, unaware of the storm brewing in their father's mind. Layla nodded, confirming what Mark couldn't yet believe. "Yes, Mark. These are your daughters. Maya and Leah." Mark's heart skipped a beat as the weight of her words sank in. His mind was in a whirlwind, and everything he thought he knew about his life, his future, and his carefully controlled world suddenly felt fragile. How could he have missed this? How could he have not known? The questions were endless, but there was one that stood above them all. How could he, Mark Jameson, the man who had built his entire life around work, family, and responsibility, be so unaware of this huge part of his life? As Layla stood there, calmly watching him, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: uncertainty. He had always been so sure of himself, so in control. But now, standing before him were two little girls, his daughters, and a woman who had been part of his life in a way he could never have imagined. His empire, his success, everything he had worked for, suddenly seemed insignificant. He was no longer the powerful CEO. In this moment, he was a man confronted with the most shocking and overwhelming truth of his life. Mark stood in the doorway, his mind racing as the reality of the situation started to sink in. The woman, Layla, was standing there with his two young daughters, and his brain refused to accept what she was telling him. It wasn't possible. He didn't remember her. He didn't remember having children. There had to be some mistake. This was all a bad dream. But the giggles of the twins, their tiny faces glowing with innocence, cut through his confusion and forced him to face the truth. He stepped inside the room, his heart pounding, his mind swirling. "Wait, are you sure? I mean, are you absolutely certain?" he stammered, his voice shaky. He was trying to find some logical explanation, some way to explain away what was happening. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a mistake. He could see it in their eyes, the twins' eyes. They looked like him. And Layla, though he didn't recognize her fully, carried a sense of familiarity that made his stomach turn. Layla sighed softly, her expression growing more serious. "I understand that this is a lot to take in, Mark. It was never my intention to spring this on you like this, but I thought you should know the truth." She paused for a moment, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm not trying to trap you or cause trouble. I just wanted you to be part of their lives if you wanted to be. That's all." Mark didn't know how to respond. He was frozen, caught between the shock of what he had just heard and the overwhelming realization that his life had just changed forever. He had always seen himself as a man in control, his career, his wealth, his entire world had been carefully managed, structured. But now, standing in front of him were two children, his children, and the woman who claimed to have shared a part of his past that he couldn't even remember. How did this happen?" he asked quietly, as though he were trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't understand. He wasn't sure what he was asking. What could he even ask at this point? But Layla answered anyway. "We met at a conference in Chicago, like I said. We spent some time together. It wasn't planned, Mark. It was just a few days. We were both there for work, and one thing led to another." She paused, looking down at the twins, who were still playing, oblivious to the tension in the room. "I didn't want anything from you at that time. But when I found out I was pregnant, I decided to keep the girls and raise them myself. I never wanted to involve you because I wasn't sure how you'd react." Mark swallowed hard, the words sinking in. He had always been careful about the people he allowed into his life, especially with women. He had built his empire by keeping things straightforward, clean, and controlled. He had never let emotions or distractions cloud his judgment, yet here he was, standing in front of a woman he barely remembered and two children who had been living their lives without him. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice cracking a little. He wasn't angry, he was just confused. He didn't know whether to feel betrayed, stunned, or just helpless. Why wait so long to come forward? Layla took a deep breath, as if considering her words carefully. "I didn't think it was necessary. I thought you'd be better off without knowing. You were busy with your career, Mark. I didn't want to disrupt your life. I wasn't sure if you'd even care, to be honest. But as the years went by, I knew I couldn't hide this from you forever." Mark paced the room, running his hand through his hair, trying to clear his thoughts. His mind was still reeling, and the reality of fatherhood, of being a father to two children he didn't even know existed, was crashing over him in waves. Layla remained calm, her gaze following him as he walked back and forth. "You don't have to be a part of their lives, Mark," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know the truth. These girls deserve to know their father. I'm not trying to pressure you, but I think you should at least think about it." Mark stopped in his tracks and looked at her, his eyes narrowed, trying to process the weight of her words. "So, you're just going to leave it up to me?" he asked, his voice steady but uncertain. "You're not going to force me into anything?" "I'm not going to force you into anything, Mark," Layla said firmly. "I just want you to make an informed decision, whatever that may be." Mark's mind was spinning, but as he looked over at the twins, he saw something he hadn't expected to feel: guilt. These two little girls had been living without their father, and here he was, suddenly faced with the reality of their existence. He had spent his life focused on work, building an empire, chasing success, and now, at this moment, he had to decide whether or not to be a part of their lives. He walked over to the desk, leaning his palms against the wood, trying to calm his racing thoughts. "I never planned for this," he whispered more to himself than anyone else. "I didn't either," Layla replied softly, her voice full of understanding. "But now we both have to face it, and we have to figure out what comes next." Mark looked back at the children, watching them play, and something inside him shifted. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this. He wasn't sure if he could handle the responsibility, the changes this would bring to his life. But he knew one thing: these girls were his. And whether he was ready or not, he couldn't just turn his back on them. Taking a deep breath, Mark turned to face Layla. "I need time to think," he said. "This is a lot to process." Layla nodded, understanding his need for space. "Take all the time you need, Mark. I'll be here when you're ready." And with that, the silence settled between them, and Mark knew his life would never be the same again. The next few days were a blur for Mark. He couldn't focus at work, couldn't concentrate on the deals and contracts that had once been his primary concern. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Layla and the twins. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces, heard their laughter echoing in his head. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now he felt completely adrift. His carefully constructed world had been upended, and he had no idea how to navigate the mess he found himself in. He couldn't shake the image of the twins playing in his office. They were so carefree, so innocent, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing in their father's mind. How could he have missed them for so long? How could he have been so blind to this entire chapter of his life? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do now? Mark spent the following evening sitting alone in his penthouse, staring out over the city. The bright lights below reflected the chaos in his mind, a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't sort through. He had spent so many years focused on success, on building his career, on proving to everyone, including himself, that he was worthy of his place at the top. But now, he couldn't even understand how he had gotten here. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for them. The sound of the doorbell snapped him out of his thoughts. He hadn't been expecting anyone, and his first instinct was to ignore it. But something inside him urged him to answer. As he opened the door, Layla stood there, holding the twins in her arms, both of them fast asleep. Her expression was calm, but Mark could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't sure what to expect either, and that made him feel a little less alone in his confusion. "I thought I'd bring them by," Layla said softly, as if reading his mind. "I didn't know if you wanted to see them again, but I figured it was time to let you decide what comes next." Mark stepped back, silently motioning for her to come in. As she entered, he could smell the faint scent of baby lotion and something warm, something familiar, and it hit him harder than he expected. His heart ached with the realization that these two girls were his. He hadn't been there for them when they needed him. He hadn't been there for Layla. And now, standing in his apartment, he felt like an outsider to his own family. Layla gently placed the twins on the couch, their little bodies curled up together, still sleeping peacefully. Mark couldn't take his eyes off them. He had spent so much of his life focused on his own goals, his own ambitions, that he had missed everything else. And now that the reality of fatherhood was staring him in the face, he didn't know where to start. "Mark," Layla said quietly, her voice breaking through his thoughts, "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I just want you to know that they deserve to have a father, if you're willing to be one. I don't expect you to jump in head first right away, but at least give them a chance." Mark looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't demanding anything from him. She wasn't asking him to be someone he wasn't. She was simply giving him the space to figure it out. And that, somehow, made it even harder. Because the truth was, he didn't know if he was ready for this. He didn't know how to be a father after all these years of living for himself. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to do this. How to be what they need." Layla gave him a gentle smile, one that didn't carry any judgment, only understanding. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. No one does. But you don't have to do it alone. I'm here. We're here." The weight of her words settled on his shoulders, and he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about them, too. These little girls needed him, even if they didn't know it yet. And whether he was ready or not, he was their father, and that was something he couldn't ignore. Mark sat down on the couch beside the twins, watching them sleep. His mind was still racing, still unsure of what the future held, but for the first time in days, he felt a sense of clarity. He didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to have it all figured out right away. He just had to try. Layla sat down next to him, her presence a quiet comfort. "They'll need you more than you know," she said softly. "They already love you, even if you don't know them yet. But you have time. You don't have to rush into anything. Just take it one step at a time." Mark nodded, his chest tightening. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, or if he could ever be the father his daughters deserved, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to walk away. He might have missed the first few years of their lives, but he was here now, and that had to count for something. For the first time in a long while, Mark allowed himself to feel hope. He wasn't sure how he was going to do it, but he knew that he would try. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Mark spent the next few weeks trying to adjust to his new reality, but it wasn't easy. Every time he thought he was starting to make sense of it all, something would remind him how unprepared he was. The mornings he'd spent in meetings and the evenings filled with business dinners now felt distant, like a life he had once lived but wasn't sure he wanted anymore. He was suddenly faced with a responsibility he hadn't asked for, yet could no longer ignore. Being a father, his own children, these two little girls, Maya and Leah, was a role he hadn't planned for, but now it was his. Layla was patient, never rushing him, never pressuring him. She gave him the space he needed to figure things out, but she was also always there when he was ready to talk. She kept the girls with her for most of the day, bringing them over in the evenings when Mark was home. At first, it felt awkward, like some strange, unfamiliar part of his life had been thrust into the spotlight. But over time, he began to get used to their presence. The sound of their giggles, the constant movement of their small feet, the way they would call out to him, sometimes even reaching for him with tiny hands. It was overwhelming, but there was something about it that made him feel connected. There were moments, quiet ones, when he'd sit on the couch with the girls, watching them play with their toys or read them stories. Mark would watch their little hands grasp the pages, their wide eyes full of wonder, and in those moments, he could almost forget the weight of everything else, the pressure of his career, the uncertainty of his new role. Those small moments of peace with them allowed him to begin opening his heart in a way he never thought possible. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Mark and Layla sat on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city. It was a warm night, the sky clear, and the hum of traffic below felt distant. Layla was drinking her tea, and Mark was still processing everything. They hadn't spoken much about the future, about what it all meant for them. It was as if they both needed the silence to understand where things stood. "Are you happy?" Layla asked, her voice breaking the quiet between them. Mark turned to look at her, surprised by the question. He wasn't sure what answer she expected, but it was one that he hadn't allowed himself to think about until now. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softer than usual. "I mean, I never thought I'd be in this position. I never thought about having kids. I never imagined any of this." Layla smiled gently. "I know. Neither did I. But we're here now, Mark. And I don't want you to think you have to figure everything out overnight. It's okay not to have all the answers." Mark took a deep breath, his gaze turning back to the skyline. It was strange to hear those words coming from her. He had always been the one to have everything planned out, the one who controlled every aspect of his life. And now, here he was, trying to find his way through something he had never expected. "I just don't want to mess this up," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I don't want them to feel like they didn't matter. I don't want to be that kind of father." Layla reached out and gently touched his hand. "You're already here, Mark. That's the first step. You're trying. That matters more than anything." Mark didn't respond right away, letting her words sink in. He wasn't sure if he was ready to be the father the girls deserved, but he knew he had to try. He had to make an effort, even if it was hard, even if it meant stepping outside his comfort zone. It wasn't going to be perfect, and he wasn't going to have all the answers, but he was willing to learn. Over the next few weeks, Mark started to adjust more. He began to spend more time with the twins, taking them to the park, playing with them, trying to connect in ways he hadn't before. The girls were still so young, so unaware of the complex emotions swirling around them, but they responded to his presence. They giggled when he made funny faces, reached for his hand when they wanted to be held, and smiled up at him as if he had always been there. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, Mark watched the girls running around, chasing each other, laughing. For a moment, he felt like everything was right. He had a family now. It wasn't the family he had imagined, but it was his. He was their father, and somehow, that felt like enough. "I never thought this would be my life," Mark said aloud, more to himself than to Layla, who sat beside him watching the girls. Layla smiled, her eyes soft. "Life rarely goes according to plan. But that doesn't mean it's wrong." Mark watched the twins, their little faces full of joy, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope. He didn't know what the future held, or if he would ever feel fully prepared for fatherhood, but he knew one thing: he was going to try. And that was enough for now. He was learning to embrace the unknown, to step into a new chapter, and to be the father his daughters deserved, one step at a time. The weeks passed, and with them, Mark began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. The overwhelming shock had started to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. He spent more time with the twins, getting to know them, learning their habits, their little quirks, and slowly building a relationship that, although still in its infancy, felt genuine. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when he felt like an outsider in his own life, but he found a comfort in the small victories: when Maya called him Dada for the first time, when Leah laughed at one of his silly faces, when Layla smiled at him and told him he was doing just fine. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. One morning, Mark woke up earlier than usual. He stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the city, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel weighed down by the usual pressures of work. His company was still thriving, still demanding his attention, but it no longer felt like the only thing that mattered. He had this new life now, this new responsibility, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to lose sight of it. When Layla arrived with the girls later that morning, Mark was already awake and ready. He had prepared breakfast, nothing extravagant, just pancakes and scrambled eggs, but it felt like a small achievement. He hadn't made breakfast for anyone in years, let alone for his children. He greeted them with a warmth that was becoming more natural, and as the girls scrambled to their seats, laughing and calling out to him, Mark realized how much he had already changed. There were still things he didn't know, still moments when he felt out of place, but he was starting to understand what it meant to be there for them, not just physically, but emotionally. Layla sat down at the table, smiling as she watched Mark interact with the twins. "You're getting the hang of this," she said softly, her eyes warm with approval. Mark looked at her, feeling a slight flush creep up his neck. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words. "It's not as hard as I thought," he replied, smiling in return. "I guess it just took a little time." "It always does," Layla said with a knowing smile. "You're doing great, Mark." The compliment meant more to him than he expected. For so long, he had been driven by the need for external validation, his company's success, the accolades, the approval of his peers. But here, with the girls and Layla, it was different. He was learning that the simple things, the small moments of connection, mattered more than anything he had achieved in the boardroom. After breakfast, Mark took the twins to the park. They ran ahead of him, laughing as they chased each other around the playground. Mark watched them, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and disbelief. He was their father. This was his life now. The fact that he was still coming to terms with it didn't make it any less real. As the girls played in the sand, Mark sat on a nearby bench, his thoughts drifting. Layla joined him after a few minutes, her eyes scanning the playground before settling on him. "You're doing well," she said quietly. "You know that, right?" Mark met her gaze, a mix of gratitude and uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't always feel like I am. There's still so much I don't know." Layla nodded, understanding. "You're doing better than you think. And the fact that you're trying, that's what matters. They don't need perfection, Mark. They just need you." Mark took a deep breath, absorbing her words. It was easy to get lost in the pressure to be perfect, to feel like he had to have everything figured out. But Layla was right. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to show up. He needed to be there for them, to be consistent, to be present. The rest would come in time. After a while, Layla and Mark sat down to talk about what came next. Layla was patient, letting Mark take the lead, but it was clear she had her own hopes for the future. "I think the girls deserve to know you better," she said, her voice soft but firm. "They deserve to have you in their lives, whether that means being their dad full-time or just making sure they know they have a father who loves them." Mark nodded, taking in her words. "I know I can't change the past," he said quietly, "but I want to be part of their future. I want to make sure they grow up knowing I'm here for them." Layla smiled, a hint of relief in her eyes. "That's all they need. The rest will fall into place." As they watched the girls play together, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. He still had a lot to learn, still had a lot of uncertainties, but he was beginning to understand what it meant to be a father. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer afraid to take the first steps. With Layla by his side, and the twins in his life, he knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, that thought gave him hope. It had been a few months since Mark had fully stepped into his role as a father, and although the adjustment hadn't been easy, he was beginning to find a rhythm. The moments of doubt still crept in from time to time, but they were becoming fewer. He had learned to embrace the chaos that came with raising two toddlers, the unpredictable schedule, the endless questions, the constant need for attention. At first, it had been overwhelming, but now, it felt like a natural part of his life. Maya and Leah had become his world in a way he hadn't expected, and even on the toughest days, he found himself smiling at their antics, even if just for a moment. The company still demanded his attention, but it no longer held the same all-consuming grip it once had. His time with the girls had become more important. He'd reorganized his schedule, canceled a few meetings, and even delegated more responsibilities to his trusted team. Layla, of course, had been supportive throughout it all. She never asked him to choose between his career and his family, but Mark could tell she appreciated that he was trying to make time for the girls. One afternoon, after a particularly long week at work, Mark decided to take a break and spend the day with Layla and the twins. It was a rare moment where his calendar was clear, and he didn't want to miss it. He woke up early and started breakfast, determined to make it a good day for all of them. When Layla and the girls arrived, Mark was already in the kitchen, cooking pancakes. Maya immediately ran over to him, wrapping her small arms around his leg. "Morning, Daddy," she exclaimed, looking up at him with her big, bright eyes. Mark smiled down at her, feeling his heart swell. "Good morning, sweetheart. You ready for some pancakes?" he asked, his voice full of warmth. Leah toddled into the room shortly after, holding on to Layla's hand, her little face lighting up when she saw the pancakes. "Pancakes," she squealed excitedly. The morning was filled with laughter and the usual flurry of activity that came with two toddlers running around. As they sat down to eat, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. These small, everyday moments were the ones that made him feel more alive than any business deal or corporate achievement ever had. After breakfast, they decided to take the girls to the park. Mark wasn't sure what to expect, but Layla seemed to know just how to make the day feel special. They arrived at the park, and the girls immediately ran toward the swings. Mark, although not much of a park person, found himself laughing as the girls squealed with delight, their small legs kicking in the air as they swung higher and higher. Layla sat on a nearby bench, watching with a contented smile as Mark pushed the swings, his face lit up with joy. "You're really good at this," she said, her voice gentle. Mark glanced over at her, a little surprised. "What do you mean?" he asked, still pushing the girls on the swings. "I mean, you've come a long way," Layla replied. "I can see how much you care about them, how much you've changed. When we first met, you were, well, let's just say you weren't exactly the hands-on dad type." Mark chuckled, feeling a little sheepish. "I wasn't, was I?" he admitted. "I guess I was so focused on work that I never even considered what I was missing. But now, I can't imagine not being a part of their lives." Layla smiled, her eyes softening. "I'm glad. They're lucky to have you." As the afternoon wore on, Mark found himself lost in the simple pleasure of being with his daughters. They ran, they played, they laughed. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't anything extraordinary, but it was everything. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Later, as the sun began to set, they sat on a blanket in the park, the twins resting their heads on Layla's lap while Mark leaned back against the grass, staring up at the sky. The world seemed quieter here, simpler, and in that moment, it was as if all the noise of his life, the constant demands, the meetings, the phone calls, had faded into the background. There was nothing more important than this, nothing more fulfilling than these small, beautiful moments with the family he never thought he'd have. Layla looked over at him, her expression thoughtful. "Mark, I know things haven't always been easy for you. But I want you to know I'm proud of you. I'm proud of how far you've come, of how much you've changed." Mark turned to face her, a hint of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected to hear those words, especially from her. But hearing them made him realize just how much this journey had changed him. He wasn't the same man he had been before. He was still learning, still growing, but he was getting better, and that mattered more than anything. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'm proud of you too, Layla. I don't think I could have done this without you." She smiled and gently kissed his cheek, her touch warm and comforting. "We're in this together, Mark. Always." As the evening faded and the stars began to appear in the sky above, Mark sat quietly, holding Layla's hand as the girls drifted off to sleep. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, and times when he would feel like he didn't know what he was doing. But for the first time, he felt like he had a direction. He had a family. And that was all he needed to know that he was on the right path. Mark had started to understand the complexity of balancing his professional life with his newfound role as a father. It wasn't easy. The tension between his duties as CEO and his responsibilities at home still existed, but something had shifted inside him. He was no longer chasing success for the sake of success. There was more to life now, something that transcended the meetings, the business deals, and the long hours at the office. He had 2 little girls who needed him, and he had a woman beside him who was quietly showing him what real partnership meant. One evening, after putting the twins to bed, Mark found himself sitting with Layla on the couch, watching the soft glow of the city lights outside their apartment. There was a quiet peace in the air, a rare moment when everything seemed to slow down, and they had a chance to just be together. Layla turned to him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something. "How are you feeling about everything, Mark?" she asked gently. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat back and let her words settle in. "I'm still figuring it out," he said finally. "Some days, I feel like I'm doing okay. But then there are moments when it feels like I'm in way over my head." Layla nodded, her expression soft with understanding. "I get that. But I've seen you with them. You're doing great. You're trying, and that's all they need." Mark let out a long breath, as though releasing some of the tension that had been building up inside him. "It's just. I've never had to care about anyone else like this before. I've always been focused on my career. I thought that was enough. I thought it was all I needed to do." "I know," Layla said, her voice low. "But now, you have them. And that changes everything. But I don't want you to feel like you have to be perfect. You're still learning, and that's okay." Mark looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you. You've been patient with me. With us. I can't imagine trying to do all of this without you by my side." Layla smiled softly, reaching out to take his hand. "We're a team, Mark. You don't have to do this alone." As the weeks went by, Mark began to find a better rhythm between his 2 worlds. He started to schedule his work around the girls more, carving out time for them in ways he hadn't before. The company was still thriving, but it was no longer the only thing he cared about. He found himself prioritizing the small moments, taking the girls to the park, reading them stories at bedtime, making pancakes on Sunday mornings. Each of these moments, however insignificant they might have seemed to him before, now felt like treasures. One weekend, Mark decided to take the girls on a trip to the beach. He had been meaning to get away for a while, but it was always easier to push those thoughts aside in favor of another meeting or another business call. This time, though, he had made up his mind. It was time for a change. Time for him to be fully present with his family. They drove out to the coast early in the morning, the twins' laughter filling the car as they looked out the window at the passing scenery. Mark had never really been a fan of long drives, but today felt different. The fresh air, the open road, the sound of the girls' excited chatter in the back seat, it all felt freeing. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next business deal or the next deadline. He was just in the moment, enjoying being with the people who mattered most. When they arrived at the beach, Mark helped Layla set up a small picnic spot while the girls ran toward the water, their tiny feet kicking up sand as they giggled. Mark watched them, his heart swelling with pride. These were his daughters. And in this moment, nothing else mattered. The beach stretched out before them, a vast expanse of blue sky and ocean, and Mark realized how much he had been missing before. The day passed by in a blur of laughter, sandcastles, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Mark played with the twins, pushing them on the swings, chasing them along the shoreline, and feeling the pure joy of being present in their lives. Layla watched them, her smile soft and proud. She had always been the one to keep things together, to make sure everything ran smoothly, but now, as she saw Mark with the girls, she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the changes he was making. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the beach, Mark sat down next to Layla, watching the twins play with their toys in the sand. The quiet was peaceful, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt a sense of balance in his life. He wasn't perfect. There were still moments when he doubted himself, when he felt out of place, but he was trying. And that was enough. "I never thought I'd be here," Mark said quietly, almost to himself. "I never thought this would be my life." Layla turned to him, her hand finding his once again. "But here you are," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. "And you're doing great." Mark looked at her, his heart full of emotions he couldn't quite name. He had come a long way. He wasn't the same man he was when he first found out about Maya and Leah. He had changed in ways he never expected, and although the future was still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let go of this new life. His family. His girls. They were worth everything. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark realized that the real success in his life wasn't measured by the profits he made, the deals he closed, or the recognition he received. It was measured by the love and laughter of the little family he had, the one he never saw coming but now couldn't imagine living without. And that, more than anything, made him feel like the luckiest man alive. Mark stood in front of the window, watching as the city lights twinkled below, his thoughts drifting as the world outside seemed to keep moving while his life had changed in ways he never imagined. The past year had been a whirlwind, filled with moments of doubt, uncertainty, but also undeniable growth. The man who had once been solely consumed with his career, with his company, with building his empire, was now someone who was learning to be present, to embrace the unpredictability of family life. It wasn't always easy, and there were still times when he felt out of his depth, but there was a quiet peace in knowing that he had changed, and that the people he loved saw that change in him. Layla had always been there, patiently guiding him without pushing, giving him the space to figure it out for himself. She had taught him more about love, patience, and commitment than he'd ever learned in the boardroom. Watching her with the twins, Maya and Leah, had shown him what truly mattered, what it meant to be a father, and what it took to build a family. It wasn't just about doing the right thing anymore, it was about being there, being consistent, and most importantly, being someone they could rely on. He had made mistakes, he had been selfish, and for a long time, he hadn't even realized how far removed he was from the things that truly mattered. But now, when he looked at his daughters, he felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. They needed him, and even though he was still learning, he was finally willing to give them everything he could. Today was special. Layla had organized a small family celebration to mark the one-year anniversary since they had started their new life together. Mark hadn't realized it, but this was a milestone. A year had passed, and they were all still here, still learning, still growing, but together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As the evening wore on, Layla smiled at him from across the room as Maya and Leah played with their toys. Mark was sitting in a chair, his attention fully on them, laughing at their antics. It was the kind of evening that felt simple but filled with joy. The warmth in the room, the soft glow of the lights, the comfort of being together, it was all he had ever wanted but never fully realized until now. "Mark," Layla called softly, walking over to where he sat. She knelt down beside him, her eyes full of love and understanding. "You've come so far in such a short time. I just wanted you to know how proud I am of you. Of everything you've done for us." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't used to hearing those words, especially from Layla. She had always been there, supportive and steady, but hearing her say it aloud made everything feel real, made all the hard work worth it. "I'm not perfect, Layla," Mark said quietly, his voice full of emotion. "But I'm trying. I'm trying to be the man you deserve, the father they deserve." "You're already doing it," she said, placing a hand on his. That's all they need. And that's all I need. Mark swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle in his heart. He knew he wasn't perfect. There would always be more to learn, more to give, but in this moment, he finally felt like he was enough. He didn't have all the answers, and there would be challenges ahead, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had found his place in this family, and that was more than he could have hoped for a year ago. The girls ran over to him, giggling as they pulled at his hands to get his attention. Mark smiled, his heart swelling as they climbed into his lap, their tiny arms wrapping around him in a hug. He didn't need any words to know how much they loved him. He could feel it in the way they held on to him, in the way their faces lit up when they saw him. Mark hugged them back, feeling the overwhelming sense of gratitude and love that had become a constant in his life. He never thought he would feel this way, so connected, so grounded. Everything had changed in ways he couldn't have predicted, and even though it hadn't been easy, it had been worth it. Layla stood beside them, her smile warm as she watched the family she had helped create, the family they were all becoming. For the first time in a long while, Mark wasn't focused on the future or the past. He was here, in this moment, with the people he loved, and that was all that mattered. As they sat together, laughing and playing, Mark realized that his life had taken a turn he hadn't expected, but one that had filled him with more purpose than he could have ever imagined. He wasn't just the CEO of a successful company anymore. He was a father. And as he looked at Layla and the twins, he knew this was the greatest success of all. He leaned back, his arms around the girls, and in that quiet moment, Mark finally understood what it meant to be truly happy. It wasn't in the business deals, the wealth, or the status, it was in the love he had found, in the family he had built, and in the life he was now living. And as he looked at Layla, he knew that this was only the beginning of their journey together. No matter what the future held, they would face it as a family. Together. And that was enough. The ending of this story is both poignant and powerful, encapsulating the theme of growth and redemption. Mark's journey from a driven, self-absorbed CEO to a father learning to balance his personal life with his career is a testament to the transformative power of love and responsibility. What's striking about the conclusion is how it doesn't focus on grand, dramatic gestures or instant perfection. Instead, it highlights the quiet moments, the moments of connection, the small victories, and the willingness to try, even when unsure. Mark's realization that being a father is about being present, making mistakes, and learning from them, rather than being perfect, is both humbling and relatable. It's a reminder that family is not about having everything figured out but about showing up, day after day, and doing the best you can. The relationship with Layla adds depth to this. Her patience and support were key in Mark's transformation, not by pushing him but by allowing him to find his own way. The ending isn't about a neatly tied-up resolution where everything falls into place. Instead, it's about the ongoing journey of learning, adapting, and accepting that the most meaningful success comes from the connections we build with others, not just the achievements we rack up. In Mark's case, what seemed like an unexpected, overwhelming change turned out to be the most fulfilling chapter of his life. And that's a message of hope. Even when life throws us into the unknown, there's always the potential for growth, for love, and for a happiness we never saw coming. He noticed her right away, a graceful black grandma standing in the theater aisle, clearly in need of a seat. Without hesitation, he stood up and offered her his spot. "Thank you, dear," she said with a warm smile. But he had no idea that her next move would change his evening entirely. A few minutes later, she quietly called over an usher and whispered something to him. The man was invited to follow them, and what he saw next was completely unexpected. What do you think happened next? Share your guesses in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how this amazing story unfolds. The theater buzzed with the low hum of anticipation, an orchestra of soft murmurs and the rustle of programs blending into the warm, inviting atmosphere. The man stepped into the grand hall, the glow of chandeliers casting a golden light across the polished floors. He adjusted his coat and glanced at his ticket, eager to sink into the plush comfort of his seat and lose himself in the evening's performance. The room was nearly full, the audience settling into their places with a mix of excitement and quiet expectation. The man found his row and began weaving through the seated patrons, murmuring polite apologies as he passed. He had just reached his seat when something caught his attention out of the corner of his eye. Near the entrance to the aisle, an elderly black woman stood with a steady grip on a wooden cane, a modest handbag resting on her arm. She was dressed impeccably, her long coat neatly buttoned, and a scarf draped over her shoulders in an understated elegance. Yet, despite her poised demeanor, there was an undeniable look of uncertainty in her eyes as she scanned the rows of occupied seats. The man noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. People nearby glanced in her direction but quickly looked away, feigning engrossment in their programs or adjusting their seats unnecessarily. It was a collective avoidance, an unspoken refusal to engage. The warmth of the theater seemed to dim slightly in that moment, replaced by an invisible wall of indifference. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking between his own seat and the woman. She didn't look lost, exactly, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that suggested she wasn't unfamiliar with such situations. But she was clearly in need of a seat, and no one seemed inclined to offer one. His heart tugged at the sight. He thought of his own grandmother, who often spoke of the small kindnesses that had stayed with her throughout her life. With a quiet sigh, he stood, straightened his jacket, and made his way toward her. "Excuse me," he said gently as he approached. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, he caught a flicker of surprise in her expression. "Would you like to take my seat?" The woman's lips parted slightly, and then a warm, gracious smile spread across her face. "Oh, thank you, dear," she said, her voice rich and steady despite her age. "That's very kind of you." The man motioned toward his seat, stepping aside to let her pass. "It's no trouble at all," he replied, offering her his arm to help her navigate the narrow aisle. She accepted it with a nod of appreciation, and together they made their way to the row. As she sat down, the murmurs in the audience seemed to grow louder, a subtle wave of whispers rippling through the nearby seats. The man noticed the sideways glances and the barely concealed frowns. He felt a flicker of discomfort, but he pushed it aside. The woman's gratitude was genuine, and that was all that mattered. "Thank you again," she said, settling into the seat. "You didn't have to do this, but it means a great deal." He offered her a small smile. "Enjoy the performance," he said simply before stepping back to find a place to stand near the side of the hall. He didn't mind, he wasn't here for comfort, he was here for the experience. As he leaned against the wall, he couldn't shake the feeling that this simple act had somehow shifted the energy of the evening. The cozy atmosphere he'd walked into now felt layered with something more complex, as though his small gesture had sparked a ripple that he couldn't yet fully understand. The man barely gave himself time to think. His body moved instinctively, his conscience guiding him before his mind could argue. Rising from his seat, he stepped into the aisle and gently addressed the elderly woman. Her attention turned toward him, her eyes widening slightly in surprise at the unexpected kindness. "Ma'am," he said with a soft smile, gesturing toward the seat he'd just vacated. "Please, take my seat." For a moment, she hesitated, as though trying to gauge whether his offer was genuine. Then her expression softened, a warmth spreading across her face that seemed to lighten the weight of the room around her. "Oh, thank you, young man," she said, her voice steady and rich with sincerity. "That's very thoughtful of you." The man nodded and stepped aside to let her through. As she carefully made her way into the row, leaning lightly on her cane, he extended a hand to steady her. She accepted the small gesture of support with quiet grace, lowering herself into the seat with a relieved sigh. She adjusted her coat and glanced up at him with a look that held more than gratitude. It was a silent acknowledgement of his humanity, a connection that didn't require words. "Bless you," she said simply, her tone carrying a weight that struck him deeply. He offered a polite smile in return, murmured, "You're welcome," and prepared to step aside. But as he straightened, he couldn't help but notice the ripple of discontent that seemed to spread through the audience. Heads turned subtly, eyes glancing sideways, and whispers fluttered like restless birds among the rows. Though no one spoke loud enough for him to catch their words, the disapproving energy was palpable. He caught a few expressions: furrowed brows, pursed lips, quick, disdainful glances in the woman's direction. It was as though his simple act of offering his seat had broken some unspoken rule, stirring an unease that no one seemed willing to articulate. The man shifted his weight uncomfortably, his shoulders tensing as he felt the unspoken judgments aimed at him as well. Was it the woman's presence? Her race? Or perhaps the audacity of her being there at all? The man couldn't say for certain, but the undercurrent of prejudice was unmistakable. It prickled at the edges of his awareness, igniting a quiet anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior. But then his eyes returned to the woman. She sat with her hands neatly folded over her lap, her posture dignified, her gaze directed forward as though the unspoken hostility around her didn't exist. She was a picture of quiet resilience, and that alone was enough to bolster his resolve. Let them whisper, he thought. Let them frown. He had done what he believed was right, and no amount of disapproval from strangers could change that. He moved to the side of the aisle, finding a spot to stand where he could still see the stage. As he leaned lightly against the wall, he watched the woman settle into the seat he had given her. The performance hadn't even begun, but the man felt as though the evening had already taught him something profound. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness weren't small at all, they could be a quiet act of defiance, a stand against the unspoken prejudices that lingered just beneath the surface. And as the murmurs in the audience faded and the lights dimmed, he stood a little taller, ready to face whatever the night might bring. As the lights in the theater dimmed slightly, signaling that the performance would soon begin, a restless energy buzzed through the audience. The man stood near the edge of the aisle, his posture calm but his mind alert to the subtle undercurrent of whispers that had begun to ripple through the room. At first, the murmurs were faint, almost indistinguishable from the normal pre-show chatter. But as the minutes passed, the tone of the conversation shifted. The man caught fragments of words, muted phrases exchanged in low, conspiratorial tones. A woman seated a few rows ahead leaned toward her companion, her lips pressed into a tight line as she glanced back toward the elderly black woman now seated comfortably in his former spot. Her companion frowned and whispered something in return, his eyes narrowing slightly. Others joined in the silent commentary. A man in a tailored suit tilted his head, his gaze lingering on the woman with an air of condescension. A couple seated nearby exchanged looks, their expressions a mix of discomfort and disapproval. No one spoke loudly enough for their words to carry, but their body language said enough. The woman's presence was unwelcome to them, and the man's act of kindness had disrupted their carefully constructed sense of propriety. The man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes scanning the room as he felt the weight of their glances. He wasn't a stranger to judgment, it was an unfortunate reality of the world he lived in, but the collective nature of it in this moment was unsettling. It wasn't just one or two people reacting. It was a quiet, pervasive discomfort that seemed to ripple outward, filling the space with an invisible tension. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. He knew what these looks meant. The whispers weren't about him, they were about her. Her presence, her dignity, her right to occupy the space she was in. They saw her as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong, and by extension, they questioned his choice to offer her a seat. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in his mind. Had he done the right thing? Should he have stayed quiet, kept his head down, and avoided drawing attention to either of them? The thought was fleeting but sharp, a reflection of the deeply ingrained fear of standing out that society often instilled. Then he looked at the woman again. She sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her face turned toward the stage. Her expression was serene, almost regal, as though the judgment radiating around her simply didn't exist. She wasn't oblivious, he could tell by the slight tilt of her head, the way her eyes occasionally flicked to the side to catch a stray glance, but she carried herself as though their opinions were beneath her notice. The man felt a surge of admiration. Whatever doubts he had melted away as he watched her. Yes, he had done the right thing. There was no question about it. The disapproval of strangers, however loud or silent, could not outweigh the value of treating someone with respect and kindness. Straightening his shoulders, he let the whispers wash over him, refusing to let them seep into his sense of self. If these people were so concerned with appearances that they couldn't see the humanity in a simple act of decency, that was their burden to bear, not his. As the orchestra began to tune their instruments, the whispers gradually died down, replaced by the low hum of anticipation for the performance. The man adjusted his stance and folded his arms lightly across his chest, his resolve firm. Tonight, he had made a choice to act in the way he believed was right, and no amount of disapproving glances could take that away. As the orchestra finished tuning and the murmur of the audience began to settle, the elderly woman leaned slightly forward in her seat. With a composed yet hesitant glance, she turned her attention to a young staff member stationed nearby. Dressed in the theater's formal black and white uniform, the usher stood with an air of detachment, holding a clipboard and scanning the rows for latecomers. "Excuse me, young man," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to be polite but not disruptive. The warmth in her tone was impossible to miss, a quiet dignity imbued in every word. "I was wondering if there might be a way to..." Before she could finish, the usher turned to her, his face betraying a flicker of irritation. His eyes quickly scanned her, lingering just a moment too long on her cane and modest attire, as though silently assessing her worthiness of his time. His posture straightened, and his lips pursed into a tight line. "Ma'am," he interrupted curtly, "if you're not in your assigned seat, there's nothing I can do." Her expression faltered for the briefest of moments, a flicker of disappointment crossing her face. "I was only asking if," she began again, her tone still gentle. "Like I said," the usher cut her off, his voice sharper this time, though still low enough to avoid attracting attention from the surrounding audience. "I can't help you. If you need something, you should have addressed it at the box office before the performance." From his vantage point near the side of the aisle, the man who had given up his seat overheard the exchange. His jaw tightened as he caught the subtle sneer in the usher's tone, the way his words were laced with a dismissive impatience. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, as if her presence was an inconvenience he'd rather not deal with. The woman, however, remained composed. She straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze with quiet resolve. "Thank you for your time," she said simply, her words tinged with the unmistakable grace of someone who had learned to endure such moments without letting them define her. She turned back toward the stage, her face impassive, though the man could sense the weight of the interaction in the slight droop of her shoulders. The usher didn't bother responding. Instead, he turned his attention back to his clipboard, his demeanor suggesting that he considered the matter closed. The man couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration at the scene. The indifference, the thinly veiled condescension, it was all too familiar, a reflection of the subtle yet pervasive prejudices that so often went unchallenged. Taking a step forward, he considered intervening, but the woman's calm composure stopped him. It wasn't resignation, there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, a refusal to let the moment define her evening. Still, the interaction gnawed at him, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. The usher, oblivious to the growing tension around him, moved further down the aisle to assist another patron, his demeanor noticeably more accommodating. The disparity wasn't lost on the man, nor on a few of the nearby audience members who had witnessed the exchange. Some exchanged knowing glances, their discomfort evident, though none of them spoke up. As the lights dimmed further and the performance prepared to begin, the man felt a simmering resolve build within him. The woman might have let the moment pass, but he couldn't. Something about the way she had been treated struck a nerve, igniting a quiet determination in him. This wasn't just about her, it was about a pattern, a system that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. He took a deep breath, his eyes lingering on the woman for a moment longer. Her grace and resilience in the face of such treatment were humbling, but he knew that grace alone shouldn't have to bear the burden of change. As the curtain began to rise, he resolved to find a way to address what he had witnessed, knowing that some acts of kindness required more than a single gesture, they required action. The room was dim now, the theater bathed in a soft glow from the chandeliers above. The quiet hum of the audience fell to a murmur as the orchestra prepared to play. The man, leaning casually against the wall near the aisle, let his gaze drift back to the elderly woman. She was seated calmly, her hands resting neatly in her lap, her face serene but focused. For a moment, it seemed the evening would simply proceed as expected. But then, something unusual happened. The woman shifted slightly in her seat, glancing toward the usher who stood a few feet away. She raised a hand in a subtle gesture, catching his attention. The young man approached with a mix of hesitation and duty, bending slightly to hear her as she whispered something quietly. Her words were too soft to carry, but whatever she said caused the usher's eyebrows to lift in surprise. He straightened, glancing back at her with an expression that teetered between confusion and curiosity. The man by the wall frowned slightly, his curiosity piqued. The interaction was brief, just a few whispered words and a nod from the usher, yet it seemed to shift the energy around them. The usher turned on his heel and walked toward the man, his polished shoes clicking softly against the theater floor. "Sir," the usher said politely but firmly, stopping just a step away. "Would you please follow me?" The man blinked, caught off guard. "Follow you?" he asked, his tone uncertain. He glanced at the elderly woman, who now wore a small, enigmatic smile. She nodded toward him, as if to reassure him that everything was fine. "Yes," the usher said. "Both of you, actually." He gestured toward the woman and stepped back to allow her to stand. The man's confusion deepened, but he complied. He wasn't the type to cause a scene, and besides, there was something intriguing about the situation. He stepped into the aisle, offering the woman his arm as she rose from her seat. She accepted it with a gracious nod, leaning lightly on his support as they followed the usher toward the rear of the theater. The path the usher led them on wasn't the expected route toward an exit or a more discreet seating area. Instead, they moved through a small, side corridor, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly against the polished marble. The man's curiosity grew with each step. What was going on? Had the woman said something that required them to leave? But if that were the case, why did she seem so calm, even pleased? The usher stopped before an ornate wooden door with brass fixtures, a door that seemed almost too grand for its purpose. With a practiced motion, he opened it and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "Please, right this way," he said, his voice softer now, almost deferential. The man exchanged a quick glance with the woman, who gave him a knowing look and a faint smile. She stepped through the doorway first, her cane clicking lightly against the threshold. The man followed close behind, and as they entered the room, he realized they were no longer in the main theater. It was a private box, an elegantly appointed space with velvet armchairs and an unparalleled view of the stage. The golden trim on the railings gleamed softly in the light, and the seats looked as though they had been designed for royalty. It was, without question, one of the best spots in the entire venue. The man turned to the woman, his expression a mix of surprise and incredulity. "What is this?" he asked quietly. She settled into one of the plush chairs with an air of quiet satisfaction. "This," she said, her voice calm but tinged with amusement, "is where we're meant to be." Before he could respond, the usher spoke again. "Enjoy the performance," he said, offering a slight bow before retreating. The door closed softly behind him, leaving the two of them alone in the opulent space. The man stared at her, still trying to piece together what had just happened. "I don't understand," he admitted. "What did you say to him?" The woman chuckled lightly, her eyes twinkling with a mix of humor and wisdom. "I simply reminded him of who I am," she said cryptically, adjusting the scarf around her neck. "And who I'm with." Her words hung in the air, leaving the man with more questions than answers. But as the lights dimmed further and the first notes of the orchestra filled the air, he decided to set them aside for the moment. He sank into the chair beside her, the plush fabric embracing him as he let the music wash over the room. Whatever had just transpired, he couldn't deny one thing: it was already shaping up to be a night he wouldn't soon forget. The private box was as opulent as it was unexpected, its velvet-lined chairs and gilded railings offering a stark contrast to the dim, murmuring theater they had just left behind. But as the man followed the usher and the elderly woman further into the labyrinthine corridors of the theater, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than an upgrade in seating. The usher led them past closed doors and through ornately decorated hallways, the faint sound of the orchestra tuning up behind them. The woman, despite her age and reliance on a cane, moved with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. She said little, but the subtle lift of her chin and the calm in her eyes suggested she was completely at ease, as if she had walked these halls countless times before. The man, however, felt an increasing sense of curiosity and confusion. What exactly had she said to the usher to warrant such a shift in treatment? And why did she seem so comfortable in a place that had initially treated her with such coldness? Finally, as they approached another grand set of doors, the usher turned to them with a more respectful demeanor than he had displayed earlier. "If I may say so, ma'am," he began, his tone hesitant but sincere, "it's an honor to have you here. We've missed your presence at the theater." The man's brow furrowed. Missed her presence? He glanced at the woman, who offered the usher a small, gracious smile but didn't respond. The usher, perhaps realizing he had overstepped, quickly pushed the doors open, revealing yet another luxurious space, a lounge area reserved for special guests. As they entered, the man finally spoke, his curiosity getting the better of him. "I feel like I'm missing something," he said, glancing between the woman and the opulent surroundings. "Why does it seem like everyone here knows you?" The woman paused, turning to face him fully. For a moment, she studied him, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then, with a quiet sigh, she gestured for him to sit. He complied, settling into one of the plush armchairs, his gaze fixed on her. "My late husband," she began, her voice steady but tinged with a distant sadness, "was one of the original benefactors of this theater. His generosity helped keep its doors open during difficult times, and our family's contributions are still part of what allows it to flourish today." The man's eyes widened slightly as he absorbed her words. "Your husband," he echoed. She nodded. "Charles Whitmore," she said, her tone softening at the mention of his name. "Perhaps you've heard of him." He had. Charles Whitmore was a name synonymous with philanthropy in the city, a man known for his generosity, particularly in the arts. The theater itself bore plaques commemorating his contributions, though the man had never paid much attention to them before. "But if that's the case," he said slowly, "then why," he trailed off, unsure how to phrase the question tactfully. "Why do they treat me this way?" she finished for him, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "Because to some people, history doesn't matter. My husband's name may be on the walls, but my skin is what they see first. And for those who can't look past it, I am nothing more than a reminder of what they'd rather not acknowledge." Her words hit him like a punch to the chest. He thought back to the whispers in the audience, the judgmental glances, the dismissive tone of the usher when she first tried to speak to him. It all clicked into place, each interaction now sharpened with the weight of understanding. "But you," he hesitated, then pressed on. "You don't seem angry." She chuckled softly, the sound carrying a mixture of amusement and resolve. "Oh, I've been angry before," she admitted. "But anger only takes you so far. I've learned that sometimes, the best way to fight ignorance is to show them what dignity looks like. To remind them that their prejudice doesn't define me, or my worth." The man sat back in his chair, her words sinking in. She wasn't just a bystander in this story, she was a fighter, someone who had endured far more than the evening slights and still carried herself with grace. "And what about tonight?" he asked. "Why did you call the usher over?" She smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Sometimes," she said, "you have to remind people of exactly who you are." The man couldn't help but smile back. For all her quiet composure, there was a fierceness to her, a refusal to let the world diminish her, no matter how hard it tried. As the conversation continued, the orchestra's opening notes filtered faintly through the walls, marking the start of the performance. But for the man, the real lesson of the evening had already begun, one that would stay with him far longer than any play. As the usher led them into the exclusive VIP section, the difference in atmosphere was immediately palpable. The gilded railings and plush seating exuded luxury, but the air carried a distinct chill, one not caused by the theater's ventilation. The patrons who occupied these coveted seats, dressed in designer suits and shimmering evening gowns, turned their heads in unison as the elderly woman and the man entered. It wasn't just curiosity in their eyes, it was something sharper, more pointed. The kind of look that dissected and dismissed all at once. Conversations hushed to murmurs, punctuated by furtive glances and subtle gestures. A woman in a sequined dress whispered something to her companion, her lips barely moving but her disdain unmistakable. He nodded in agreement, his eyes narrowing slightly as they swept over the pair. The man felt the weight of the stares almost immediately. It was as though every eye in the room had turned into a scalpel, cutting away at their right to be there. He straightened his shoulders instinctively, glancing at the elderly woman for guidance. To his astonishment, she appeared utterly unbothered. Her expression remained calm, her movements deliberate as she allowed the usher to guide her to one of the best seats in the house. She settled in with the grace of someone who had occupied such spaces countless times before, as if she had every right to be there, which, of course, she did. The man followed her lead, sitting beside her, but the unease lingered. He could feel the judgment radiating from the other patrons, their silent disapproval filling the room like an unwelcome draft. Some avoided looking directly at them, choosing instead to whisper behind raised programs. Others made no effort to hide their contempt, their gazes heavy with unspoken accusations, "They don't belong here." A middle-aged man in a tailored tuxedo leaned slightly forward, his sharp features twisted into a subtle sneer. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" he muttered to the woman beside him, his voice low but audible enough to carry across the rows. "You'd think they'd keep the exclusivity a little more exclusive." The woman next to him smirked, tapping her manicured nails against her champagne flute. "Standards must be slipping," she replied, her voice dripping with condescension. The man clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to respond, to snap back at their audacity, but a soft touch on his arm stopped him. The elderly woman had placed her hand there, her expression serene but her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "Don't let them rattle you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're just afraid of what they don't understand." Her words struck him deeply. He exhaled slowly, releasing the tension in his shoulders, and nodded. She was right. Their presence here wasn't the problem, it was what their presence represented, a disruption to the unspoken rules of this exclusive circle. She wasn't just a woman in a seat, she was a challenge to their carefully curated world, a reminder that legacy and worth could not be confined to their narrow definitions. As the lights dimmed and the orchestra began to play, the murmurs gradually faded, but the undercurrent of judgment lingered. The man glanced at the elderly woman again, her face illuminated softly by the stage lights. She sat upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze focused on the performance with an expression of quiet defiance. She didn't need to say anything to make her presence known, she was a force simply by being. The man felt a surge of admiration for her courage. Here, in this room full of people who sought to diminish her with their silence and their stares, she held her ground with grace and dignity. She didn't need their approval, she had already claimed her place, not just in this theater, but in the larger story of what it meant to challenge prejudice and privilege. As the performance unfolded, the man allowed himself to relax. The music swelled, filling the room with its grandeur, and for a moment, it seemed to drown out the hostility around them. Yet he couldn't help but wonder, how many more rooms like this had she walked into, met with the same frosty reception? How many times had she faced the quiet contempt of those who refused to see her for who she truly was? The thought stayed with him, a quiet reminder of the strength it took to sit where she sat, to face what she faced, and to do so with unwavering dignity. This was more than a performance, it was a lesson, a story unfolding not just on the stage, but in the lives of those who dared to disrupt the status quo. And as the music rose to its crescendo, he realized he was witnessing something far more profound than he had ever anticipated. As the curtains fell for intermission, the theater buzzed with muted conversation and the soft clinking of champagne flutes. The elderly woman sat quietly, her hands resting lightly on the arms of her chair. The man beside her, still grappling with the frosty reception they'd received, leaned closer, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "I have to ask," he began hesitantly, his voice low to match the intimacy of the moment. "You seem so calm about everything that's happened tonight." "I don't know if I could be." The woman turned her gaze to him, her dark eyes shimmering with a mix of wisdom and weariness. "It's not the first time, and it likely won't be the last," she replied softly. "But you learn to carry yourself differently when you've been here long enough." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The man frowned slightly, sensing there was more to her story. "You've been coming to this theater for a long time?" he asked. She let out a quiet laugh, not bitter but layered with decades of unspoken truths. "My late husband and I helped build this theater," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Our contributions kept it open during the lean years. Without us, it might not even exist today." The man's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You helped build it?" He paused, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile her words with the treatment she had endured tonight. "Then why would they treat you like this?" The woman's expression softened, though a flicker of pain crossed her face. "Because to them, I'm not a benefactor or a supporter. I'm just a reminder of what they wish to ignore. My family's contributions don't erase the fact that I'm a black woman in a space they've long considered their own." Her words struck him like a physical blow, the weight of their meaning settling heavily in his chest. I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she said with a small smile. "It's not your fault, but it is part of a much larger story." She shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze drifting toward the stage as if recalling memories etched into its very fabric. "My husband believed in the arts, in their ability to bring people together. He thought this theater could be a place where all were welcome, where talent and passion mattered more than appearances. And for a time, it was." Her voice grew quieter, tinged with a sadness that felt as old as the theater itself. "But as the years went on, I started noticing the cracks. The way people would look at me, speak to me, or avoid me altogether. It didn't matter that my name was on the donor wall or that my husband's legacy kept this place alive. To some, I was always an outsider." The man felt a knot form in his stomach. He glanced around the room, the opulent decor suddenly feeling more like a facade than a celebration of culture. "And tonight?" he asked. "Why did you decide to come back, knowing all of this?" She turned to him then, her eyes sharp and clear. "Because of you," she said simply. "Or rather, because of people like you." He blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" "You saw me," she explained. "When everyone else looked past me, you offered me your seat. A simple gesture, but a powerful one. It reminded me of why my husband and I believed in this place to begin with. Kindness like that has the power to challenge prejudice, even if only for a moment." The man's throat tightened. He hadn't thought much about his decision to give up his seat, it had felt like the obvious thing to do. But hearing her words, he realized the ripple effect of even the smallest actions. "This theater," she continued, gesturing to the room around them, "it's not just about performances or prestige. It's a reflection of who we are as a society. And every time someone like you chooses to act with kindness, it chips away at the barriers that have been built here. He nodded slowly, her words settling deep within him. He had come to the theater expecting a performance, but what he was learning now felt far more important than anything that could be staged. As the lights dimmed once more and the orchestra began to play, the woman leaned back in her chair, her expression serene but resolute. The man glanced at her, a newfound respect shining in his eyes. He knew the evening wasn't just about her story, it was about the stories they all carried, and the choices they made to shape the spaces they inhabited. And for the first time, he understood the true power of her quiet defiance. As the final curtain fell and the audience erupted into applause, the elderly woman remained seated, her hands clasped lightly in her lap. The man beside her noticed a shift in her demeanor, a quiet determination that seemed to settle over her like a cloak. She glanced at him briefly, her eyes filled with an unspoken resolution, before she rose to her feet. "I'll be right back," she said softly, her voice calm but resolute. He opened his mouth to ask where she was going, but something in her expression told him not to question her. Instead, he nodded, watching as she made her way to the edge of the private box, where an usher waited. The conversation between them was brief. The usher's face shifted from surprise to understanding, and within moments, he guided her down a side staircase that led directly to the stage. The man in the box leaned forward, his curiosity turning into a quiet awe as he realized what she was about to do. When she stepped onto the stage, the applause began to waver, the audience noticing her presence. Whispers rippled through the crowd, a mixture of confusion and curiosity. The conductor, who had been preparing to address the audience, stepped back graciously, allowing her to take the spotlight. She stood at the center of the stage, framed by the heavy velvet curtains. Her figure, small yet commanding, seemed to draw every eye in the room. Her cane tapped softly against the floor as she adjusted her stance, and then, with a steadying breath, she began to speak. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady but warm, carrying effortlessly across the room. "I know I'm an unexpected addition to tonight's performance, and I thank you for allowing me this moment." The audience stilled, their murmurs fading into a silence so complete that even the faint rustle of programs ceased. The woman's presence was magnetic, her calm demeanor inviting attention rather than demanding it. "Some of you may recognize my name," she continued. "It's etched into the donor wall in the lobby, alongside my late husband's. Charles Whitmore believed in the power of the arts to unite us, to inspire us, and to remind us of our shared humanity." Her words hung in the air, the weight of her legacy becoming clear to those who hadn't known her story. A few audience members exchanged glances, their expressions tinged with guilt or surprise. "But tonight," she said, her tone softening, "I was reminded that the spaces we build to celebrate that humanity are often the very spaces where it's most tested." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Earlier this evening, a man in this very room offered me his seat. It was a simple act of kindness, one that he didn't think twice about. But it carried a weight he might not have realized. It reminded me, and I hope it reminds all of you, that how we treat one another matters deeply. Not just in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments, the everyday interactions that reveal who we truly are." The man in the box felt his chest tighten. Her words were measured, but they carried an undeniable power, each one landing with precision. "I've walked these halls many times," she continued. "I've seen the beauty of this theater, but I've also seen its cracks. The glances, the whispers, the unspoken judgments. These things don't belong in a place meant to bring us together. And yet, they persist." Her voice didn't waver, but it carried a deep sadness, a weight born from years of experience. "Change doesn't come easily," she said. "But it starts with acknowledgement. With kindness. With courage. And tonight, I saw that courage in a small but profound gesture." She turned toward the private box where the man sat, her eyes meeting his across the expanse of the theater. "To the man who offered me his seat, thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. Your kindness reminded me that there is still hope for us to be better. The audience reacted in waves. Some erupted into applause, their clapping a declaration of support for her words. Others sat in thoughtful silence, processing what they had heard. A few, visibly uncomfortable, began gathering their belongings, slipping out of their seats and disappearing into the shadows of the exits. The woman didn't seem affected by the mixed reactions. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of gratitude, before stepping away from the spotlight. The conductor approached her, shaking her hand with visible respect before helping her off the stage. As she returned to her seat, the man rose to meet her, his expression a mix of admiration and humility. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. She smiled, her eyes sparkling with a mix of warmth and determination. "Sometimes," she said, "the truth needs to be spoken aloud. Even if not everyone is ready to hear it." The performance had ended, but the impact of her words lingered, reverberating through the theater like the final note of a symphony. For the man, and for many others in the room, it was a moment they would not soon forget. As the crowd slowly filtered out of the theater, the man remained seated in the private box, his thoughts swirling. The evening had started as an ordinary trip to the theater, but it had become something far greater, a lesson in humanity, a confrontation with unspoken biases, and a call to action. He glanced at the elderly woman beside him, her serene expression illuminated by the soft glow of the now empty stage. She had been the catalyst for it all, her resilience and grace lighting a path he hadn't even known he needed to follow. The usher approached them once more, his earlier indifference replaced with genuine respect. "Ma'am, sir," he said quietly, "thank you for your patience tonight. I've been instructed to extend an apology on behalf of the theater." The woman gave a slight nod, her expression unreadable. The man spoke up, his voice steady but firm. "An apology is a start," he said, "but what matters is what happens next." The usher hesitated before nodding in agreement. "We've already begun discussing changes," he admitted. "Policies, staff training, and community outreach, things that should have been addressed long ago." The man felt a flicker of hope. The theater wasn't just acknowledging its flaws, it was taking steps to fix them. He turned to the woman, who gave him a small smile, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word. As they stood to leave, other theatergoers approached them, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. A young couple thanked the woman for her bravery, while an older man shook the man's hand, admitting that her speech had forced him to confront his own biases. The ripple effect was undeniable, her words and his simple gesture had started something bigger than either of them had anticipated. Walking out into the cool night air, the man couldn't help but reflect on how a single act of kindness, offering a seat, had set everything in motion. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it had made a difference. He realized that change didn't have to begin with sweeping gestures, it could start with something as small as recognizing another person's worth and acting accordingly. The woman turned to him as they reached the street, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You did more than you realize tonight," she said softly. "Sometimes, all it takes is one person to remind others what's possible." He nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "And you reminded me that staying silent isn't an option," he replied. "If we want the world to change, we have to be part of that change." As they parted ways, the man watched her disappear into the night, her figure strong and steady against the backdrop of the city. He felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that her story, and his small role in it, was far from over. What about you? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a small act of kindness that sparked something bigger? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep these conversations alive and inspire more moments of change.